Hello, my name's Charlie Morley. I'm a best-selling Hay House author specialising in lucid dreaming, mindfulness of dream and sleep, and shadow integration practices. But today, I'm here to talk with my good friend Erik Jampa Andersson about his brand new book, Unseen Beings. So, Erik, tell us, who are you and how did you come to write this book?
Who am I?
Good question, right? Who are you?
Exactly. That's a big one to start off with. I'm Erik Jampa Andersson, and I am the author of Unseen Beings, How We Forgot the World is More Than Human. I find it very difficult to, as I was telling you a few minutes ago, I have a very poor elevator speech for myself because I've meandered down a lot of different paths in my life, and I tend to do a lot of things at once. I'm classically trained as a Tibetan medicine practitioner, which is sort of, what I have on paper as the thing that I sort of identify with most directly, but I do a lot of research and more sort of scholastic work in a lot of fields. I study history specifically, particularly environmental history, and my research really focuses on the intersection between health, ecology, and mythology, as well as religion and spirituality more broadly. So that's really sort of my primary focus at the moment. And yeah, I'm thrilled to be here with you today. Thanks for sitting down with me to have a chat about this book.
Thank you for being here with me. So, the journey of the book, as an author myself, I know sometimes we can trace it to an exact moment where we're like, I got to write about that. Sometimes it's like a slow evolution. How was it for you? How did the book come about?
It was a little bit of both. The seeds of this book have been there for a long time. There's, this book it's interesting for a few reasons. Each chapter really approaches the primary questions of the book in a different way, reflecting really different fields and, sort of interests that I've engaged with over the course of my life. So the seeds have been there for a very long time. I talk quite a bit in one of the final chapters about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is something that I first encountered 25 years ago. And I wouldn't say I was planning to write this book 25 years ago, but there were certain seeds of enchantment, seeds of, fascination and inspiration that have really been there for a long time. But it's interesting because when I first set out to write this book, it looked very different. It wasn't really this. I was primarily interested in talking about, Tibetan medical paradigms and Tibetan Buddhist paradigms, especially relating to nature spirits. That was the kind of key spring of the book, was an interest in talking a bit about those paradigms, because I've always found them very fascinating, very applicable and useful to think about, to be able to sort of calibrate our sense of where we are and who we are in the world. So it started out with that, but as soon as I started writing, I found that I was really being led into much more of a kind of ecological focus, recognizing that those two paradigms are not entirely disconnected, that there is spirit paradigms and nature spirit paradigms are themselves a kind of ecological ontology, a kind of way of looking at the so-called natural world, which pervades the world. Countless cultures, every culture at a certain point in human history believed in the existence of non-human beings that populate the natural world, some of whom are literally unseen conventionally, who have their own personalities and their own ways of being, and we have relationships with them. So that was sort of the way through, but then the book ended up pulling in a lot of different pieces from different areas of research and interest that I've had, and turned into this. I would say that one of the motivations behind that process was very much climate anxiety. It was really feeling quite strongly, especially with COVID, that we are in a moment of crisis. We've been in a moment of crisis for a very long time. This crisis isn't a new thing, but we desperately need different ways of thinking about our relationship with so-called nature, our existence as human beings in a more than human world. So this really arose out of that desire to try to shed light on that. And this question of, how did we forget that the world is more than human? That was really an important jumping off point for me.
Yeah. So you talk about some of the inspiration of the book coming from this relationship to the climate crisis we're in. My question to you is, how long have we been in this crisis for? Because sometimes it's presented as like, this has just happened.
Yeah.
We're not going to make net zero, all this kind of stuff. But how far back does it go? And how long have we been falling into what is now classed as or called the environmental crisis?
Yeah, so a long time. It's been a really long time. And it sort of depends on how you identify a starting point. I talk about it in the book. I talk about the climate crisis as a kind of like chronic disease. And chronic diseases tend to be difficult to sort of identify a starting point for. If you consider something like, like an alcohol-related liver disease, how do you determine when that actually began? Do you determine it based on when your blood tests come back showing, abnormal markers in certain liver enzymes and so on? Would you consider it to be when, you start identifying as an alcoholic or your drinking starts becoming problematic? Do you go back to when that person had their first drink ever in their lives? Do you go back to childhood trauma that might have compelled them to start using alcohol in an unhealthy way later on in life? It's very difficult to say. Do you talk about generational trauma that might have then trickled down into the individual's life that then creates these circumstances? It's very difficult. And this really ties into a big conversation that's being had everywhere, especially in, sort of like hard science circles, which is, when did the Anthropocene begin? And this term, the Anthropocene, the epoch of humans, it has a very specific meaning. It's a geological epoch that's determined based on a significant shift in the fossil record. And geologists pretty unanimously agree that we are in a new epoch now than we have been for the past, 10, 12,000 years. But then the question is, when did we shift into this new epoch? And basically the three major candidates for that are the mid-20th century, like the 1950s, which was a period known as the Great Acceleration, when, carbon emissions and deforestation and all kinds of different factors sort of took this, hockey stick shape and skyrocketed. The second option is that it began with the Industrial Revolution, when we started extracting and burning fossil fuels en masse and, industrialization began. And then the third option, though these aren't really ordered in any particular way, is the beginning of the European colonial era. And those three periods of development are very intimately linked, obviously. Colonization ultimately allowed for the primitive accumulation of resources and the usurping of land and peoples and resources and exploitation of slave labor and so on, which enriched European societies in order to be able to facilitate an industrial revolution. And then that industrial revolution led to the Great Acceleration in the mid-20th century. So you can see that this is like staging a disease almost. Yeah. So then we could look at the earliest proposed starting point and say, okay, well, it's, the beginning of the colonial era around 500 years ago. But that didn't come out of the blue. It's like, it's the same thing as a liver disease. Yeah. It didn't just begin at that point. There are pre-existing factors that led to those sorts of outcomes. The mentality of dominating the world, of establishing hierarchies of beings, of exploiting other beings for, the benefit of the so-called master identity, those weren't new ideas. Those had been there for thousands of years. I think on a certain level, we could go all the way back to the beginning of animal agriculture as a really significant moment where our relationship with the world around us changed. But I think more specifically, we can look at the past 2,500 years as being a really significant period where certain philosophical paradigms have reigned supreme and really inspired mass colonialism, domination, exploitation, and so on.
Something you said there that were lots of interesting things, but one of the most interesting things where you were referencing how can we find the beginning of like an addiction, and it made me think of the work of Johann Hari, who looks at, in most cases, addiction is a response to trauma. Yeah, right. It's not the addiction, it's the trauma that led to the addictive behaviors. If part of the climate crisis now is due to our addiction to progress, our addiction to dominating the natural world, what is the original trauma that led to that addiction?
I mean, I think anthropocentrism itself is sort of both sides. Anthropocentrism is incredibly alienating. It makes our lives much more miserable, much more difficult. It causes us to ask questions like, are we alone in the universe? I had mentioned to you the other day, there was an article in the Scientific American last August where an author asked the question, she says, given the math, it seems impossible that human beings would be the only living things in the universe. And you read that, and at first you're like, oh, that makes sense. Like, extraterrestrials probably exist. But then you look at it again and you realize, oh my God, do we really believe that humans are the only living things
yes.
in the universe? It's absurd. There are at least millions of species of living beings on this planet that we know of, but we still automatically assume, we implicitly assume that we are the only ones that have value, and thus we're the only ones that really exist. Yeah. And that's traumatizing as hell. Yeah. And when you take that along with, like religious and spiritual paradigms that suggest that the entire order of the universe is essentially monarchical, there is a single authority, and this is the sort of, great philosophical contribution.
Usually a he.
And he is a monarch. There's monarchy and monotheism. They're very closely related paradigms. They arise from the same fundamental assumption about the nature of the universe, which is that there is one being, one individual who's in control of everyone else. They set the terms, they create everything, they're in charge, they determine everyone's fate. They are the absolute authority. And then religion ends up becoming a system of, supplicating yourself before this being, and sort of bowing before them and following their rules and so on. And that's also pretty traumatizing, especially when you're told that if you don't do this, then you're going to burn for eternity in, a lake of fire. So I think when you get that, plus you get the entire rest of the world utterly disenchanted for you, there is no meaning to be found anywhere except in the human experience, and the human experience is just about worshiping a single God who is not a great person by all accounts, and that's the whole meaning of life. I think that's incredibly traumatic. That fundamental split between humanity and nature, where nature is reduced to a storehouse of resources and the human becomes the only thing of value in the universe, that's an incredibly traumatizing and alienating way to live.
And of course it wasn't always that way. As you talk about in your book, the original kind of inherent philosophy of mankind seems to have been animism. Yeah. The belief in spirit or consciousness or some sort of awareness in all things. Yeah. In the rocks, in the trees, in the people, in the animals. In your book, you call for a return to animistic thinking, or at least a return to exploring this possibility of animism. Yeah. Can you tell us what you mean by that and how a return to an animistic view of the world might look?
Yeah, absolutely. So, animism, it's interesting because animism the term was first coined by Edward Tyler, the sort of father of anthropology, and the way that it was positioned, hundreds of years ago was very different than how we talk about it today. It was deemed to be this primitive original religion, which was actually deemed to be kind of the first fall from reason. It was deemed to be the first delusion that led to later religious delusions like the belief in gods and spirits and so on. This is from Tyler's perspective. So this obviously wove itself in quite nicely with colonial paradigms of portraying indigenous peoples around the world as inferior, less evolved, and then thus justifying their oppression.
Because they still believe in plant spirits and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, the whole concept, that if someone can't tell the difference between a person and a thing, then they are incapable of managing their own affairs. But then the person making that assertion is projecting their own judgments about what is a person and what's a thing. A person is a human being, a homo sapien, and the thing is absolutely everyone else. So, feasibly, if an indigenous person were to say, well, this tree is a person, or this bear is a person, or this deer is a person, or what have you, then from the colonial perspective, that's primitive, unevolved barbarism.
So we must re-educate.
And destroy your cultural traditions because they're obviously just delusions and stories. And we still kind of do that. Our perspective has changed a lot, and anthropology approaches to animism have changed a lot. There's sort of the Graham Harvey generation of anthropologists who talk about new animism as really just a way of relating with the more than human world. It's a paradigm of relationship. It's not a belief system. There are no tenets, there are no gods, there are no specific rituals that one must do in order to be an animist. It's just a way of experiencing and relating with the world around us as a relational paradigm. So this was the original way of living. This is how all humans across the planet lived for the vast majority of our existence as human beings. And I think that's something that's really important for people to understand. For the vast majority of human society, for the vast majority of human history, most human societies have not perceived nature as this external, unconscious inner world that is in internal opposition to the human. Anthropocentrism has not been at all a common belief amongst human beings.
This is the experimental stage, right?
Absolutely.
A few hundred years.
Absolutely. Even concepts like ancestor worship, shamanic rituals, deities, gods, and so on, those were all later developments historically from animism, what we term animism, the belief that non-human beings are potentially ensouled or have some sort of internal experience, a subjective personhood that can be related with actively. And realistically, this isn't just like a human belief. This is how we must assume that every animal, when they encounter another animal, they aren't assuming that that other animal is dead inside or that we're dead inside and that they're the only ones that exist. That's an absurd notion. It takes a lot of cognitive dissonance and a real separation of our senses from our cognition to be able to make that sort of a jump. It's this bifurcation of nature, which they talk about a lot in like sociology and like critical ecology, which is this separation from what our senses are telling us about the nature of things. When we look at a dog in the eyes and we see that this is a living being with an inner life that we are in relationship with, but then there's the other level of truth that has been imposed upon us over the past couple hundred years, which is that that's actually not real. All that is a biological machine governed by instincts and chemicals, and there is no actual being that you can engage with. They're just an instinct-driven robot, whereas our human mind obviously is more than that because we have supposed free will.
So you mentioned this idea of personhood a couple of times there, and in the book I did have to like read it twice because I was even reading the book with an open mind. I was like, but wait, persons mean people.
Yeah,
and then I was like, hang on, person doesn't necessarily mean people, it might mean human people. It's a personification. And in the book you look at the personhood that can be found in a forest, in a tree, in an animal. Tell us about that, this idea of firstly personhood being limited to humans, and secondly your more expansive view of seeing personhood found in all things.
Yeah, so I mean this ties in with the notion of animism. For the majority of our history, again, most human societies have acknowledged a vast array of human and non-human persons as the beings that inhabit our world. So it was very much the standard. It was common on every inhabited continent on the planet for people to perceive the animals, plants, landscapes, rivers, oceans, mountains, and so on around them as being potentially spirited, which is a term that we use. That's our concept of there's a body and a spirit are separate things. That isn't necessarily how it's been historically or how it is in non-Western cultures. But the concept that they are themselves persons, that they have an internal perspective on being, they have their own needs and desires, their own point of view, and that our relationship with them is in fact a relationship. It's not us persons using those resources. It's different kinds of persons entering into relationship with one another. Even in situations where the other persons are themselves victims of what we would term violence, what we would think of as violence, and what I would certainly perceive as genuinely being violence. So like hunting paradigms. People have hunted for a very, very, very long time. Obviously, we've hunted and gathered far longer than we've raised animals as livestock and grown crops and so on. But for most societies, a prey animal is still identified as a person. They are still identified as a being who has their own subjective point of view, and the relationship that's formed between a hunter and their prey is a kind of relationship. And it involves all kinds of relational activities. It involves, attempts to, placate them or lure them in or seduce them. It involves, ritual arts and magical procedures and all kinds of different things that might be used in order to relate with them in a way that will eventually result in them dying and humans consuming them. But there's a whole social paradigm that envelops that relationship. There are mutual responsibilities between a hunter and their prey in, for instance, a lot of Native American traditions, spanning both American continents. This is pretty consistent across the world. And a lot of people will have the concern, rightly so, that this is reducing a vast plethora of diverse indigenous cultures to one monolithic monolithic sort of entity, and that is very much not the case. What this should point out to us, the fact that these sorts of paradigms are in fact so pervasive amongst indigenous and non-European, non-Western, non-modern societies, is that that is a far more organic way of looking at the world. We are the outliers. The concept that humans are separate from nature, that we dominate nature, that we are the only conscious agents, we are the only persons, that is the outlier. It's no different than the concept of, a thrice omni God that lives in heaven and sends people to heaven or hell after death. When we hear that, we know, oh, that's a specific belief in this specific tradition. It's not something that everyone on the world naturally believes. It's something that you have to learn about. Anthropocentrism is the same exact thing. So the concept of non-human, of persons encompassing both humans and non-humans, is way more basic, is way more fundamental, more natural in a sense than the concept of anthropocentrism. So acknowledging non-human personhood is simply acknowledging that a dog or a cat, or potentially also a tree or a flower or a river or a mountain or the earth itself, could be a minded, conscious, sentient individual that we have to be in relationship with.
Yeah. Something you said there about nature, and in the book you spoke about how the prevalent human view at the moment is that nature is something that animals are in. Like nature and animals, and then you have humans separated from this. And humans, we can go into nature, we can have a walk in a forest, and I'm in nature, and then as if we leave the forest and we're out of nature. And of course, nature is, we're existing within nature, we're part of nature, right? Tell me about that, your view on the separations that humans have made between animals and nature and humans and nature.
Yeah, these are really arbitrary categories. It's the same thing as the belief in a thrice omni God, etc., the concept of anthropocentrism. It's a notion, it's a philosophical idea that some people came up with in very specific cultural contexts, which were then expected, sort of, imposed upon the world through colonial processes. And then we still take it today as being the baseline sort of basic assumption about the nature of the world. We use this term nature all the time. There's a great book, Lorraine Datsun, called Against Nature. Excellent, very accessible, thin book. But she talks about the different ways that we use this term, because it carries a lot of weight. We use nature to talk about our own nature, or the nature of a substance or an item, which was the original use of the term. But the projection of this concept of nature onto what's out there, that's a relatively recent phenomenon. That isn't something we've been doing for a very long time. But it goes with this separation of non-human nature and human culture, and we think that these are entirely different things. We assume that human culture is something that arises through the human mind, our lovely rational free will, yada yada yada, and that non-human nature is an entirely different thing that has no culture, and it's not a contributor to culture, just as human culture isn't supposed to contribute to nature. This is one of the arguments at the basis of the Anthropocene theory, which again has very sound geological evidence, but even the term Anthropocene, the epoch of humans, is so dangerous for so many reasons, because it's a narrative. It's really much more than a geological epoch. It's a story. It's a story that we tell ourselves about what it means to be human in a more than human world. But it's very much rooted in this fundamental separation between humans and nature. And the assumption is that long, long ago, humans didn't impact the world around them. We didn't have a meaningful impact on our climate. But over time, we've evolved from being mere species to becoming geological agents akin to the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. This is the standard Anthropocene narrative. That's never been true. We have always had an impact on our environment. The gases that we emit when we exhale are actively terraforming our planet. We are natural beings in a natural world. If nature means anything, then we have to accept that we are also a part of nature, and that everything we do is in fact a part of nature. So then it stops being about, we need to stop imposing our human world upon the natural world, and instead we need to start asking some hard questions about the kinds of relationships that we're forming with actual other beings, not this amorphous, undifferentiated nature, that we treat as an amorphous, undifferentiated humanity. There's no such thing as either of those. it's also not the case that all humans have contributed to this process. I mean, if you ask the 50 million plus Native American peoples that were killed in the first 100 years of European colonization in the Americas alone, they were not the anthropos that were destroying the natural world and that were creating this horrific situation that we now find ourselves in. A lot of human societies have found themselves on really the losing end of these incredibly oppressive hierarchical paradigms. It's not about our human nature being bad. It's not about humanity being bad. It's not that humans shouldn't interact with the natural world. It's that very specific human powers and human institutions, the same ones that believe that we should have eternal dominion over the earth itself, and that there's a natural hierarchy of beings in which there's a master group of people and there are lesser groups of people. Those same institutions took it upon themselves to systematically colonize and destroy and exploit the entire world that is within their reach. So, yeah. That was a bit tangential. But
no, not tangential. You know, I was sitting here going like, this dude's got the passion, man. We need to get you in the House of Parliament, like speaking to the MPs. It's like, you got this. It's like, I feel the fire, man. You're carrying the fire. This is so good. So, like, where do we go from here? This book seems to be like a, what I was going to say, yes, a paradigm shift, but a, like the manifesto is the word I was looking for. This seems like a manifesto for a new way of interacting with the environment. As the writer of such a manifesto, where do we go from here?
I mean, it definitely has its manifesto-y moments, which wasn't entirely my intent. But the book has it comes in 4 parts. There's 4 parts to it, and I base it on actually a medical paradigm that has been used throughout Eurasia and throughout the world for thousands of years. It's the basis of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, which is diagnosis, etiology, prognosis, and treatment. Those are the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah.
It's, what is the disease? What do we have?
Cool.
Where did it come from? What's going to happen in the future, and how do we treat it? So I tried to approach like the climate crisis from that point of view. And I find the second part of that to really be one of the most important things that the book offers is an explanation for how did we get here. So trying to explain, how did the philosophical paradigm of anthropocentrism come into being, and why did it end up becoming so prominent in the world? So looking at ancient Greece, looking at philosophical developments with Plato and Aristotle and so on, looking at how that found its way in, new blossoming very domineering religious traditions, how those two systems were integrated over the centuries, and how those ended up informing modernity as we know it, including and especially colonial expansionism. So explaining how we forgot the world is more than human is, I think, a really important first step, because we have to understand how the hell we got here in the first place, and what exactly in our conception of the world needs to be changed in order to be able to find a way forward. Prognosis in the book is probably the lightest. I talk a bit about Tibetan medicine and also some of the ways that things like pandemics and poor health amongst humans are symptomatic of climate distress, especially the emergence of like zoonotic infections. That's a very clear consequence of increased transgression against nature's boundaries, the destruction of wild places, our mistreatment of animals in particular, and then also a number of other problems in our social systems and in our ecological sort of paradigms. But then there's the treatment. There is the treatment. And, the thing that I think is important when it comes to approaching our way through the Anthropocene is that we need to really, we need to be careful perpetuating the idea that the point is for us to save nature. A lot of sort of mainstream environmentalism is really centered around this concept that what we need to do, we didn't mean to destroy the earth, we were just pursuing progress, and accidentally we fell into using these terrible fossil fuels, and those are the root of all evil, and that's the only problem, and all we need to do is divest from fossil fuels and find more sustainable forms of energy, and by doing that we can save the world. That's the sort of, surface mentality. And there's a lot of problems with that. There's the problem that we've been destroying our environments and other beings and exploiting the earth long before we started using fossil fuels. There's also the problem, naturally, that the whole notion that we are in a position to save, to impose ourselves, to impose our will on nature yet again, but with this time with noble intentions and knowing more about what we're doing, that's really problematic, because all it's doing is reifying that same basic split between humanity and nature.
Seems like a kind of global form of white saviorism applied to the environment.
Absolutely. This is, something that I do talk about a bit in the book that I mentioned is, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And I think that one of the motifs that you find in his work relating to like the story of Sauron, which is actually really nicely illustrated in the series that came out last year, Rings of Power. There's a great moment where you hear Sauron explain that his intent is to heal the world. Mm-hmm. But his intent is to heal the world through domination, through the institution of order, and through empowering himself to force everything into this state of healed order. And, there's a slippery slope there from a desire to save to a desire to dominate. And we have to be really careful of that slippery slope, because what we've been doing this entire time is precisely that. It was the ethic to try to make nature better, to make it nice and manicured and beautiful, and to impose our human brilliance on it in order to make it a better place, to make it more fruitful, to make it, more hospitable for human life. Every place that Europeans went and colonized in the world, all the Neo-Europes, the Americas and Australia and so on, these were all terraformed before people started populating them. Mm-hmm. Europeans brought their animals, they brought their plants, they brought their pests, they brought their microbes and pathogens, and they terraformed those landscapes to make them more suitable to European ways of life. From their perspective, they were improving upon what was already there. Mm-hmm. They were improving upon nature, because this is what the good Lord told them to do, was to subdue the world and to claim dominance over it. So from their perspective, they were being progressive. They were trying to help things, to make it better. So when we turn around now and say, oh, well, we're not going to do that anymore. This time we're actually going to save it and make it better. You start to realize this is a losing approach. This isn't really.
And it's the same story replaying itself.
It's the same exact story replaying itself, especially when we get into this ideology that all we need is a more sustainable source of energy. If we can just find an endless source of sustainable energy, then all of our problems will be solved and we can go on to have this perfect utopian society. What do we think we're going to do once we have an endless source of sustainable energy? We're not going to stop exploiting the planet.
Something you said a couple of days ago to me, you said, we're looking for sustainable ways, we're looking for these sustainable forms of energy to sustain our exploitation.
Yeah.
It's like the problem is the exploitation of nature, not that we need more sustainable ways to uphold our exploitation.
Precisely. I mean, this is the thing that, and I'm sorry to anyone who's having, if this causes a bit of an existential crisis, because it did for me, this recognition that when everyone talks about sustainability, what we are really talking about in most of those instances, especially when you have corporations and, certain politicians talking about this, we're not talking about, entering into a healthier and more equitable and compassionate relationship with non-human beings. We are seeking to find more sustainable ways to exploit the Earth's resources, because that's all that non-humans are. They are resources. Animals are resources, plants are resources, the Amazon rainforest is a resource. We don't need to stop exploiting those things. We just need to be more sustainable in our exploitation. This is our intention. If we find a perfectly sustainable, endless source of clean energy, we will use that energy to continue exploiting everyone and everything in our midst, unless we deal with that root cause of our chronic disease. We need to attack the root cause. So for that, to go back to the question of where do we go from here, we need to recover. We don't need to heal the earth. we do need to pull back from our destruction of the earth. We need to stop, shooting it up with the sort of ideological methamphetamine that I talk about in the book. But we don't need to reinforce our supreme agency and try to save it through dominance and through ordering everything in a more perfect way. We need to pull back a bit. We need to enter back into relationship with the non-human beings around us. We need to start caring about them, to find a way to care about non-humans and care about our planet in a more authentic way. But in order to do that, we need to recover a sense of what it actually means to be human in a more than human world. So that's the language that I tend to use regarding sort of how to even think about what we do from here. We need to focus on recovery, and it's our own recovery. We need to, we need to find a way to recover from these sociopathic, deeply egocentric and anthropocentric paradigms that we have indoctrinated ourselves with, and we've indoctrinated people around the world with for hundreds of years, thousands of years.
So Erik, the title, Unseen Beings. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so the title is intentionally a bit deceptive, and I think a lot of folks see it, at least without the subtitle, and assume it's about ghosts and spirits and sort of supernatural beings, with supernatural really being the key point there. But an unseen being, there are certainly some of those beings in this book, to be fair. It does have spirits, and I talk about gods, and I talk about demons, and I talk about the devil, I talk about all kinds of different, so-called kind of supernatural beings. But really, the unseen beings of the most concern, I think, for me and those that are really most important for us to turn our attention towards are simply those who are unseen as a function of our own disregard. Unseen beings in this context, I think, you see on the cover, there's a plant there. Plants are very much unseen beings. They're not invisible. They're not unseen because we can't see them. We can see plants, but we don't see them as beings.
Yeah.
And that's really the sort of pivot that I want to try to sort of support people through, is this recognition that we tend to go through our lives and we see other humans and we say, okay, person, and then we see plants and animals and we don't think that. We don't perceive them as being beings. We perceive them as objects, as resources, as food potentially, but we don't really acknowledge their beingness, their personhood. So unseen beings it's about all of those that we have unseen, all of those that we have disregarded quite forcefully through our paradigms of, anthropocentrism and so on. It's generally been our approach to the world that we think of, and this is a very modern occurrence, a very recent occurrence in the grand scheme of things, but the dominant paradigm that most of us are really embedded in is that all the world's a stage, and we humans are the cast of actors, animals are props, and plants and fungi and so on are set pieces. But they are all there as a background support for our human-centered stories. They are all backgrounded, quite literally, as these unseen beings. They're not intended to be a part of the story. They're intended to be a support for the human story. And we really need to get out of that. I think that's one of the most important transformations that we really need to make. We need to tell different kinds of stories that aren't just centered on the human, that give us a sense of what it means to exist in a more than human world.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Erik. There is one more question I want to ask you before we leave, which is, it's on topic but off topic. Something we spoke about in the park the other day. You spoke about how humans at the moment are more willing to start to have a conversation about the possible sentience of AI, artificial technology, before they've ever been willing to start a conversation about the possibility of sentience in nature.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
I mean, that's it. That's
fucking
precisely
nuts.
It's crazy because people are, we're talking about concepts like consciousness and sentience in very different ways today than we have historically. We've been talking about the potential sentience of AI for a long time. There's plenty of films about, some weird dystopian future where AI becomes sentient and then decides to destroy humanity and so on. But now these conversations are becoming a lot more real because of developments in generative AI and the ways that we're starting to interact with these programs. But I do find it really disconcerting deeply disconcerting, that we are a lot more willing to entertain these kinds of ideas when it comes to machines that we have programmed and who are using data sets that we've produced as humans, as opposed to acknowledging the sentience of even our closest animal kin, even profoundly intelligent animals by our human standards. And that's really what it comes down to. We entertain the possibility that AI is sentient because AI reminds us of ourselves. This is our basis of determining intelligence by and large throughout the world. Our way of thinking about things is that if an animal, specifically an animal, never anything but an animal, though that is starting to change with like plant neurobiology and so on, which I talk about in the book. But if an animal demonstrates capabilities that are similar to our own capabilities, then we will acknowledge that they are more intelligent. That's the only paradigm that we know to use, or that we've become accustomed to using. Because we think in this way, everything is on a linear hierarchical paradigm. Some beings are higher, some beings are lower. That's our basic mentality about how the world is structured. We do that with humans, we do that with non-humans. All of our most egregious isms are based on that. It doesn't matter if it's sexism, racism, ethnicism, genderism, ableism, ageism, and so on. We always have this mentality that the basic nature of reality is that we can put some beings up here and some beings down here, and there's always someone at the very top, which gives us paradigms like androcentrism, anthropocentrism, white supremacy, and so on. But these are all a sort of a projection, a manifestation of the same fundamental theory about the nature of the universe, that it's hierarchical and that there is someone sitting at the top and that the point of those below is to serve those above, and that's the nature of everything. So with that in mind, we tend to, any beings that remind us of ourselves, we put higher up on that ladder. That's our basic tendency. Even if other beings that are very unlike us can do remarkable things that we can't do, we don't really care, because we don't perceive that as being genuine intelligence, because we implicitly assume that human beings are the most intelligent species on the planet. We are the most evolved species on the planet, which is nonsense. There is no such thing as the most evolved. But this is what we think about things. So when AI looks like us and speaks like us, and when we can relate with it as something that's similar to us, then automatically we're going to say, oh, maybe this is sentient. We're still going to exploit it because we don't really care about anything other than humans. But maybe that'll change at some point in the future. But that worries the hell out of me. I'm definitely concerned about a world in which we're more willing to assign basic rights and basic intrinsic value to machines than we are for other living beings who are literally our relatives. They're literally our cousins. Every plant in this office is our very distant cousin. We are literally genetically related to them. If we were to look at our ancestors and, a whole line, a whole lineage of our forebears all the way back to the beginning of biological life, the vast majority of those beings would not be human. The vast majority of them wouldn't be mammals, they wouldn't even be animals. The vast majority of them would be entirely different kinds of beings. But we are literally descended from them. And all of the other beings that we share the world with, they are our kin. So it's horrifying that we are so incapable of recognizing that. Because just that recognition, that's how we get through this. We aren't going to fix anything, pretty much full stop, but we aren't going to fix anything by instituting new moral paradigms, or by becoming more sustainable in our exploitation, or by telling each other, no, we shouldn't do this, we should do this because this is good, this is bad, etc. We need to learn to care. That's really what it's about. And that care itself is enchanting. It's relationship. When you enter into relationship with anyone else, whether it's a partner or a parent or a child or a dog or a cat or a tree that you have a particular, moment with, that is a moment of enchantment. That spark, that moment of encountering another being, another mind, another perspective on the world, that is enchantment. And that enchantment really naturally gives rise to compassion, to love, to understanding. And it's on that basis that we can start to renegotiate our place in the world.
Yes. And on that wonderful final sentiment there about care and love for all beings, seen and unseen, thank you so much. So Erik's book is out now. Go check it out. Unseen Beings, available from Hay House and everywhere that sells books. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, dude.